Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater. I'm John Deben, Reference Archivist in Research Services. On behalf of David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, I'm pleased you could join us today, whether you are here in the theater or joining us through Facebook or YouTube. Before we hear from Justin Martin about his new book, A Fierce Glory, I'd like to tell you about two other programs that are coming up here at the McGowan Theater. This evening, November 28th at 7 p.m., renowned journalist Cokie Roberts will be joining award-winning presidential historian Michael Beschloss to discuss his latest book, Presidents of War, which examines America's wartime chief executives, and a book signing will follow. And on Tuesday, December 4th at noon, author and Washington insider Stephen Hess will be joined by Chuck Todd, moderator of NBC's Meet the Press, to discuss his book, Bit Player, My Life with Presidents and Ideas. To find out more about these and other programs and exhibits, please check our website, archives.gov, or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates, and where you also find printed information about other National Archives programs and activities. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs. Visit its website, archivesfoundation.org, to learn more about the foundation and to join online. The National Archives preserves the permanently valuable records of the federal government, among them the most significant documents about our history and our development as a nation. As you can well imagine, the Civil War remains central to that story, and the Battle of Antietam was arguably the most pivotal military engagement of the war, altering the direction of the Union strategy and bringing the end of slavery into sharp focus as an ultimate war aim. A Fierce Glory addresses that story in a fresh way, placing Abraham Lincoln more centrally into the narrative and highlighting innovations in medicine, photography, and communications that were tested in the crucible of combat on that single horrific day in September 1862. Justin Martin, a former staff writer at Fortune, is the author of 5 highly praised books. His best-selling biography, Greenspan, The Man Behind Money, was chosen as a notable book by the New York Times Book Review, and while Nader, Crusader spoiler icon, served as a primary source for An Unreasonable Man, an Academy Award-nominated documentary about Ralph Nader. His 2 most recent titles cover Civil War-era subjects, Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians, which was selected as the Outstanding Biography of 2014 by the Victoria Society, and Genius of Place, The Life of Frederick Law Olmsted, received glowing reviews nationally. Martin has made numerous television appearances on CNN, CBS Sunday Morning, and CNBC, while his articles have appeared in a variety of publications, including Fortune, Newsweek, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Justin Martin to the National Archives.
Well, it's very nice to be here at the National Archives, and thank you for that very nice introduction, John. And my book that I'm going to discuss today is called A Fierce Glory. It's about the Battle of Antietam. And I figured the best thing to do at the outset is just kind of get everybody oriented. So the Battle of Antietam happened September 17th of 1862. And it was early on in the Civil War, about a year and a half into the war. It happened surrounding the town of Sharpsburg, which was in western Maryland, right across the Potomac River from what was then Virginia. Today, it's West Virginia. Now, Sharpsburg, it's about 40 miles to the southwest of a sleepy little town called Gettysburg, which would figure very large about 9 months hence from this battle. And then it was, you trace down the Potomac River about 55 miles, and you arrive at the capital here, Washington, D.C. Now, Sharpsburg, as you can see from this old photograph, it's a very modest town. Small town, had a population of about 1,000. It was 99 years old at the time of the battle, so it dated to colonial Maryland. And this was the biggest thing that had ever happened or would happen in this small town. And I'll now tell you a little bit about what created this cataclysmic event in this small town in Maryland. So in September, the first week of September of 1862, it's cut off on the slide here, but it should tell you it was the first week of September, 1862, Confederates crossed the Potomac into Maryland, launching the first ever invasion of Northern Territory. And they had a number of ideas in mind of what they hoped to accomplish in Maryland. The first of them being they hoped to actually tilt the midterm or affect the Union midterm elections. Then as now, midterms were a big deal. It's no accident that the Confederates entered into Maryland in September, because the midterms are only about 6 weeks away. And they entered at a time when the Union commitment to the war effort was wavering. The Union had gone through a series of losses, and people were kind of losing their appetite for war. And the thought was, score a victory on Maryland, on Union soil, and perhaps it will tilt the composition of Congress. So you had Lincoln, a Republican, as president, and both chambers of Congress were Republican. But if there was to be a victory on Union soil, perhaps in the midterms, the Democrats, the out party, would sweep into power. Perhaps they would hobble Lincoln's war agenda, or perhaps they would even invite the Confederacy back into the Union with slavery intact. But that was only one of the ideas that the Confederates had in mounting this attack on Union soil. They also hoped to invite the interference of the great powers of Europe, which were looking on at this point. France and England in particular were very interested in the outcome of the next battle, that major battle that happened in the Civil War. They, as I'd mentioned, the Union had gone through was in the midst of a terrible losing streak, and England and France had secretly agreed in talks one more Union loss, and they were going to step in and try to create some kind of negotiated settlement, maybe divide these warring powers or parts of the country. Now, this was a very appealing idea to Great Britain. Of course, you just go back less than 100 years before the Civil War, and the colonials in Britain had fought a war. Britain found it very appealing, the notion that this upstart nation was so unable to govern itself that it had slipped into fratricidal warfare. And they certainly liked the notion of stepping in and maybe dividing what had been one strong nation into two weakened nations. France also found this very appealing, the idea of interfering. As it happens, during the Civil War, France was actually in its own war in Mexico. In fact, Cinco de Mayo, which people often celebrate with a shot of tequila, actually marks May 5th of 1862, when the French suffered a loss to the Mexican forces. Now, France was marauding through Mexico, intending to plunder the Mexican stores of silver. They also wanted to gain a foothold in the New World. And were France able to take Mexico, it was very appealing to them to have a smaller and weakened buffer state, Confederate state above them, and a smaller and weakened Union state, what was left of the Union above that. Yet another idea that the Confederates had, another goal that they had with this invasion, was that maybe they could tilt the state of Maryland. Maryland was what was called a border state. It had stayed in the Union, but it had retained the institution of slavery. And there were several border states other than Maryland. There was also Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. So the thought was, score a victory not only on Union soil, but on Maryland soil, and maybe this pent-up Confederate sentiment is unleashed. Maybe Maryland leaves the Union and joins the Confederacy. Maybe other border states, such as Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, follow suit. And then the Confederacy is that much more enlarged, its chances of winning that much increased. Still another idea, the Confederates had many notions of what they might accomplish at this battle, was simply, you win on Union soil, you're free to roam about the Union. And in fact, we know now from letters that were exchanged at the time that the next target, had they won the Battle of Antietam, was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which was a major transportation hub where a lot of railroads converged. But they really would have had an open field, as it were. They would have been able to menace Philadelphia or Baltimore, or who knows where. They might have even been able to menace the capital. So as you can see, the Confederates had a diabolically clever scheme with this invasion of the North. And if they could score a victory at Antietam, it would redound to their advantage in any number of different ways. However, Old Abe was no slouch, and he had a sly, secret plan of his own. He'd shared it with just a handful of his close associates, members of his cabinet. It was called the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a document that he was tinkering with periodically, but he kept it in a pigeonhole in his desk at the White House. And he was awaiting a Union victory to issue this document. Now, Lincoln was a lawyer by training. The Emancipation Proclamation is first and foremost a very clever legal document. One of the things it calls for, the main thing it calls for, is it asserted that the slaves would be declared free in the areas in rebellion. Now, you might think, how could the Union even do that? I mean, the Union had lost control of the Confederacy. That was what the Civil War was about. But that was also the genius of this particular document, because it was an assertion that the decree of the Union president was the law of the whole land. It would extend to the Confederacy. Now, Lincoln fully expected the Emancipation Proclamation would act as a beacon, and it would cause slaves in the South to flee northward to freedom. This, in turn, would hobble the Confederate war effort. Now, the Confederate Army, it did not include African-American soldiers. However, its army was entirely dependent on slave labor. Slaves worked in the fields, growing the food that was eaten by the army. They worked in factories, making the munitions that were used by the army. So if the Emancipation Proclamation could peel off a number of slaves and draw them to freedom, this in turn would diminish the Confederacy, the Confederate war machine. At the same time, the Emancipation included a first ever invitation for African-American soldiers to join the Union Army. So it had the promise of enlarging the Union Army by that much. Now, Lincoln was fully aware that the Emancipation Proclamation, for it to work, for it to be viable, it was dependent on a Union victory. And the Union was in the midst of this terrible losing streak. So he knew that it would not be valid, or it would be taken as a desperate measure if it was issued on the heel of yet another loss. Now, as I mentioned, only a handful of people were aware of the Emancipation Proclamation, members of Lincoln's cabinet, a few of his close associates. One of those was a man named William Slade. Now, Slade worked in the White House as an usher, and he was about the same age as Lincoln. They shared a similar sense of humor. They both liked to tell kind of rambling, folksy stories. By virtue of that, Slade kind of graduated from his official duties at the White House to unofficial duties, which was he became a close friend of the president. And with that role came a new responsibility. Lincoln was a terrible insomniac, and so often he called upon Slade to stay up through the night with him, telling him stories, telling him jokes. Now, Slade was an African American, so naturally during these late night sessions, often the topic also turned to slavery and Lincoln's intention to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And when I did my research, I came across some old Slade family lore, which indicated that when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Slade had memorized every last word. So now the way that I earlier got you oriented, I hope, to the town of Sharpsburg, near where the battle took place, and the surrounding communities and environs, I'll now sort of get you oriented to the battlefield proper. And after this, I'll briefly describe the battle action, so it'll help everybody to sort of have some grounding in some of the main features of this battlefield. So the battle took place in the Antietam Valley, which was just to the east of the town of Sharpsburg, which sat at the top of the hill. I'll use my laser pointer here and for what it's worth. So there's Sharpsburg, Antietam Valley surrounding it. Then the battlefield north to south was about 3 miles in extent. At the northern end of the battlefield was an unharvested 40-acre cornfield, which would become a major feature, come very into play in the battle ahead. Then about the middle of the field was a little plateau on which sat a little church called the Dunker Church. Again, this would be a major feature that would come into play in the battle ahead. Also in the middle of the field was a sunken road. It was about 1,000 yards in extent, and it was sunken by wagon wheels, but then wind and water erosion had worn it down, so in some places it was depressed as much as 4 feet beneath the ground. Then you go down to the southern end of the battlefield, and you have what was called the Roarback Bridge at the time of the battle, although it would come to be known to posterity as the Burnside Bridge, after Ambrose Burnside, one of the generals who fought there. And then meandering through the battlefield, you can see here is Antietam Creek. So the Battle of Antietam, it featured, as a Union commander, George McClellan, commanding 55,000 soldiers. Robert E. Lee was the Confederate commander, commanding about 30,000 soldiers. So as you can see, the Union had about a 2-to-1 advantage. But with someone as wily and aggressive as Lee, one can never take a numerical advantage as an advantage. Lee had in the past and was certainly capable in the future of defeating a force that was larger than his. Now, you might wonder why the battle, as I described it in the previous slide, why it sort of happened where it happened, when it happened, why it was sort of prescribed, and the battlefield had set dimensions, a 3-mile front, and so forth. Well, you might think of it almost like a chess match. So McClellan, the Union general, had been pursuing Lee through Maryland, and then Lee had selected this piece of ground around the city of Sharpsburg and the Antietam Creek and the Antietam Valley. He'd selected it as a good place to make a stand. Then McClellan, the Union general, caught up with him. So the two forces were facing one another, and it's now clear that there was going to be a big battle. Now, Lee was perfectly willing to just be improvisational. That was very much his style. So he was going to wait for McClellan to attack, and then he was going to react. And it was possible maybe McClellan would overcommit on some part of the field. That would open up a weakness for the Union that Lee could then exploit. At the same time, McClellan, when they were facing one another, McClellan hatched what will appear to be a very simple battle plan. So he was going to have Union soldiers come down through that cornfield at the northern part of the field, and then they were going to try to press the Confederates back up onto that plateau where the Little Dunker Church sat. At the self-same time, they were going to come from the south, cross Antietam Creek, and push the opposite way, and try to also press the Confederates the opposite way onto that plateau where the little church sat. And they were basically going to squeeze the Confederate force. And when they had the Confederates compacted and confounded, they were going to strike at the center, almost like you might almost picture a knockout punch to the nose. Now, this appears to be, on the face of it, a very simple 3-part plan. It was deceptively unsimple. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of men involved, the chaos of battle. And as you'll see, as I briefly describe the action in the minutes ahead, it was all about to come unglued. So the Battle of Antietam, as I said, it took place on September 17th of 1862. It started at 5:45 a.m., according to the official record. It started with very first light. And what happened at the outset was about 1,000 Union soldiers, men from Pennsylvania and New York, under the command of a general named Abram Duree, set out through that cornfield. Their intent was they expected to encounter Confederates on the other end of the cornfield, and they planned, per the battle plan, to press them back onto the plateau on which that Little Dunker Church sat. And I'm now going to read a brief passage from my book, which describes this sort of initial phase of the battle action. So Duree's line of men stood back up and started forward across open meadow to the edge of the cornfield. Here they encountered a wooden zigzag fence designed, in the words of local farmers, to be cow high, hog low. Too high for a cow to step over, too low for a hog to root under. Duree's soldiers removed the top rungs of the fencing. They slipped into the corn. They set out across the field, trying to maintain as straight a line as possible, although the tall corn divided them. Pairs of men, one in front of the other, marched down individual rows. A common feeling was fear. Trembling fingers, legs that quaked so they could scarcely support my weight, a queer choking sensation about the throat. Those are some of the sensations of going into battle as recalled by Civil War soldiers. John Meade Gould, lieutenant with the 10th May, noted that, in quotes, "It is terrible to march slowly into danger and see and feel that each second your chance for death is surer than it was the second before. The desire to break loose, to run, to fire, to do something, no matter what, rather than to walk, is almost irresistible." Close quotes. A battle line, however, was designed to promote cohesion. Even a soldier overcome by terror was loath to flee, lest he let down his comrades. Some might decide to bolt anyway, but they had first to contend with file closers, best described as a type of human bulldog. File closers were sergeants with menacingly thick builds who marched a few paces to the rear, grimacing and cursing. They relied on their fists and the flats of their muskets to drive deserters back into line. Duree's men continued through the corn. The regimental flags bobbing above the tall stalks were visible for all to see, making the soldiers' presence and position clear to the enemy. No matter. This type of warcraft, relying on so-called linear tactics, had no place for subtlety. The goal was to overwhelm an opponent with a show of brute manpower. Soon enough, the easily spotted Union battle line fell under rebel cannon fire. Shells exploded in the air above, raining shrapnel onto the men. Solid shot, 12-pound iron balls struck limestone outcroppings and ricocheted with the loopy physics of some other, more ample dimension, the marbles of giants. Cannon fire punched into the oncoming line, knocking down men, opening gaps. To halt meant certain death, as the rebel artillerists would be able to home in on stationary targets with ruthless accuracy. With shame and file closers to the rear, cannon shell falling all around, the Union line had no choice but to keep moving, uncertain of how far the cornfield extended, unsure of what would await them when they emerged. Maybe it was best not to know. And the reason I said maybe it was best, or reason I wrote maybe it was best not to know, is because at the southern end of the cornfield, unbeknownst to these Union soldiers, were 1,000 Georgia soldiers, a force roughly at the same size as they were, who had slept the night before in a ditch in full uniform, muskets beside them in battle formation. Now their leader, Colonel Marcellus Douglas, he ran back and forth and he told those Confederates to stand up briefly, pick their own personal corn row and sort of take aim on it, visualize it, and then to kneel back down and await further instructions. So I kneel back down, and just as the Union emerged from the end of the cornfield, Marcellus Douglas ran back and forth saying, rise up, and suddenly a wall of rebels was visible. They opened fire on the Union. As the Union soldiers were emerging from the cornfield, many were shot dead, others were badly injured. Those that could returned fire, and this instigated what would be a sort of a ferocious first part of the Battle of Antietam. It lasted for several hours. Both sides kept pushing back and forth through the cornfield. According to one old account I came across, the cornfield changed hands as many as 12 times, yet the Union was not able to push the Confederates back up onto that plateau where the Little Dunker Church sat. The Confederate forces also weren't able to create any kind of advantage. And so this first part of the battle was inconclusive. Meanwhile, before it was called for in the battle plan, before anybody was ready, a man named William French, a general for the Union, leading 5,700 men with 10,000 men following them, made a sudden, what appeared to be a wrong turn and hit the Confederate center long before it was called for in the battle plan. Now, anyone out here who's a reader of Civil War journals, here it is 150 years after the battle, and you could probably find one article a month speculating about why French made this mysterious wrong turn and struck the Confederate center before it was called for in the battle plan. Now, some people speculate that he simply got lost, and if you look at this old painting, you can see it's pretty rolling topography. He had 5,700 men in his charge, another 10,000 following them. But, this was a pre-walkie-talkie era. So it's possible that maybe this large mass of men just got separated from the men they were supposed to join, who were the men who were fighting in the cornfield area. Sometimes it's speculated that he was simply freelancing. He just decided to execute his own battle plan, hoped to knock out the Confederates, and hoped to achieve glory. It was known to happen in Civil War battles. There's also some speculation that maybe he was just responding to the fact that some gunfire was coming from what was called the Confederate center, and so he turned to face his assailants. It's an enduring mystery. No one's ever going to solve it. But whatever was the cause of this, the result was the same. Suddenly, long before it was called for in the battle plan, the Union soldiers turned and started attacking the central part of the Confederate line. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the main features of the Confederate center was this 1,000-yard length of sunken road. It was packed with Confederate soldiers. In front of it, they had piled stones, pieces of broken fencing, and created a very formidable bulwark. And now wave upon wave of Union soldiers hit that sunken road, trying to dislodge the Confederates. This was also a couple-hour section of the battle. It was incredibly fierce. The sunken road would come to be known to posterity as the Bloody Lane, and yet despite the ferociousness of the fighting, this part of the battle was also inconclusive. Even as the battle was raging, though, it was possible for an injured soldier to get medical aid right there on the battlefield. And Clara Barton, at Antietam, for the first time, she realized her ambition to go right to the front lines and to take care of wounded soldiers. She did not want to wait. She did not want to go to the rear take care of soldiers hours or days after the battle. She wanted to be right in the thick of things. And she set up in what's called a dressing station. And when I did my research, I found these dressing stations just terrifying. Basically, you have these mobile medical units who would follow the men onto the field, and when the action broke out, they would set up a dressing station right near the fighting. And these dressing stations were incredibly modest spots. A dressing station could be behind a stand of trees, behind a boulder, in a ditch. Now, one of the things I was struck by in my research is both sides, Confederates and Union, marked a dressing station by raising a red flag. Now, in a way, this is kind of logical. I mean, both sides had come from a common country before the Civil War broke out, and medical personnel on both sides had gone, in many cases, to the same medical schools before the Civil War. However, as you might imagine, having the same sign, a red flag, created ample opportunity for confusion. As you might imagine, a Yankee could stumble into a rebel dressing station or vice versa. And they had accommodations for this. There wasn't any kind of formal treaty or anything. It was more like a handshake arrangement, and it went as follows. If one of your guys stumbles into our dressing station, we'll treat him, but we're going to take care of our own boys first. Now, Clara Barton, she set up in a dressing station that was on a farmstead. It was incredibly exposed. There were shells bursting overhead, bullets flying through the air. At one point, she had a wounded soldier who was leaning against her, and she was giving him a drink of water from a canteen. Suddenly, she felt a whoosh at her sleeve, and the next instant, the soldier fell back against her dead, shot through the heart. When she looked, she saw the bullet hole in the sleeve of her blouse. And Clara Barton, she decided never to mend that bullet hole in her blouse. Her blouse would become part of her kind of casual uniform that she would wear into subsequent battles, and the bullet hole would serve as a kind of reminder of the terrible toll of battle. Well, about midday, the Union finally achieved a breakthrough on the southern part of the battlefield. Now, at this point, the battle plan was completely out the window. But at this point, Union soldiers managed to cross Antietam Creek via a bridge. It was called the Warback Bridge. It will come to be known as the Burnside Bridge after Ambrose Burnside, the general who led them. Many of the soldiers also forded Antietam Creek at this point, and they managed to get 12,000 soldiers to the other side, not an insignificant number. So although the battle plan was out the window, it was still possible for the Union to redeem the day. Now, what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to climb 3/4 of a mile up a hillside under withering Confederate fire the whole way. When they reach the top of the hill, there would be the town of Sharpsburg. If they could enter Sharpsburg, they could cut off, you might think of it as the Confederate exit route, back across the Potomac and into the safety of Virginia. So it's still possible for the Union at this point to destroy the Confederacy in time for dinner. Enter A.P. Hill. Now, A.P. Hill, he was one of Lee's most trusted lieutenants, and he had woken up on this day 17 miles away in the little town of Harper's Ferry. And Lee had woken up and started the day with an urgent message to Hill in which he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, a big battle's about to break out, hurry, bring lots of men. So A.P. Hill set out for this 17-mile march with 2,500 soldiers, September 17th of 1862, so it was an autumn day, but it was unseasonably warm. Now, Hill, he had red hair, he had a red beard, he wore a red calico shirt on battle days, he kept a ham bone tucked in his pocket, which was a good luck charm given to him by his mother. He would have been on horseback. He liked to be heavily armed. He kept pistols in 2 holsters, and through his belt he had all kinds of assorted blades, looked a little bit like Yosemite Sam. As I said, it was an unseasonably warm day. As you might imagine, there were a lot of stragglers. Hill was in the habit, he'd ride up behind him, he'd take the flat of his sword and he'd whack him in the butt, try to move the man along. Well, just as the Union reached the top of that hill, just as they reached the Union forces, just as they reached the outskirts of the town of Sharpsburg, just as they are about to cut off that critical Confederate exit route back across the Potomac into the safety of Virginia, just at the last possible moment, A.P. Hill, his 2,500 men, they arrived, and they drove the Union soldiers back down the hill, drove them all the way back to the banks of Antietam Creek. At this point, the sun began to set. The Battle of Antietam, which had started with first light, it lasted for 12 hours, ended with the sun setting, and it ended as a in military terms, as a tactical draw. Neither side had managed to press an advantage. However, the very next night, Lee and his hard-used army, they would retreat back across the Potomac River into Virginia, and the invasion of the North would be at an end. So even though it was a tactical draw, you might call it an optical victory. And Lincoln, who'd been so hungry for a Union victory, seized upon this optical victory to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. However, the toll was terrible. Antietam remains the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. 3,650 men lost their lives. Another 2,000 would die in the days and weeks and months following the battle. This is actually a vintage image of that plateau near the Dunkard Church with dead soldiers lying there. And then you can see the little Dunkard Church and see that it sustained a lot of artillery damage. Now the death toll was terrible, but it would have been all the worse had it not been for a medical innovator who was present at the battle. That was Jonathan Letterman, the Union medical director. He made his debut at Antietam, and he brought with him a number of world-changing medical ideas. I'll briefly just describe a couple of them. He introduced at Antietam just, you might call it almost the barest notion of triage. But even though it's a simple idea, it was an essential idea. Letterman perceived that after the battle it was going to be pandemonium. So he worked very hard to impress upon his surgeons that there were going to be men lying in front of their field hospitals on the ground in all different states of injury. It was incumbent that they pick out the men who could be saved and work on them. If a man was a goner, give him a shot of morphine to ease his pain, summon the chaplain, and let that be that. It's a very cold calculus, but it was very necessary to save lives. Letterman also showed up at Antietam with 200 of a new style of ambulance that was very important. Prior to this battle, the Union had often used ambulances that were almost like wheelbarrows. They had the advantage of being very mobile on battlefield terrain. But as you might imagine, on the uneven terrain, a soldier who'd been shot, the trip to the hospital, they were jostled and jarred and rocked, and it could be very damaging to their injuries. In fact, when I was doing my research, I came across accounts of soldiers actually dying just from the hospital, from the ambulance ride to the hospital. Well, Letterman showed up with 200 of a new type of ambulance, and one of its main features was it had a kind of rudimentary shock absorber built into it. And so this helped ease the trip that the soldiers made from battlefield to hospital. Now, Letterman, who had a number of just world-changing innovations that he introduced at this battle and subsequent Civil War battles, he would become to be known to posterity as the father of battlefield medicine. Another innovator who was present at Antietam was a photographer named Alexander Gardner. Now, Gardner was an associate of Matthew Brady, who many of you might be familiar with, the great Civil War era photographer. Now, Gardner, he was the official photographer of the Army of the Potomac, so he was the Union Army's official photographer. You might think of him almost as being embedded. And he had just been waiting for the opportunity to document the aftermath of a battle. Why the aftermath? Well, the cameras in that day, the exposure times were so long that you could not do a live action shot of something like a battle. It would have been indecipherably blurry. So you had to wait till a battle was over. And as I mentioned, the Union was in the midst of this terrible losing streak. What happens when you lose a battle? The other side, the Confederates in this case, held the battlefield. And so Gardner had been unable, particularly being the Union photographer with all of his clunky equipment, he'd been unable to travel over a battlefield and document the aftermath. However, with Antietam, that finally changed. It was a Union victory. The Union held the field, and so he was able to range freely, taking photographs. Now, he chose as his subject, the main thing he focused on was dead soldiers. And this made eminent sense. I mean, dead soldiers don't move, so they don't blur your photographs. But it also was it proved to be a very powerful choice of subject matter. Up to this point, the images that people had of battlefields were mostly illustrations that appeared in newspapers and places like Harper's Magazine, and they tended to be wildly romanticized. They showed generals waving their swords, men holding the flag high, everyone looked orderly and brave and well-dressed. By contrast, Gardner's images were so stark, these images of dead men lying on the field. And in a way, Gardner's photography worked in tandem with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was designed to invest the war effort with a new and higher purpose. Well, Gardner's photographs, which were very widely distributed in the North, they communicate for the first time to people, this is what's happening on those battlefields. This is the terrible way that men are dying. And that with it brought kind of a corollary question. If this is how men are dying, should there be a new and nobler purpose to this war? So Lincoln, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863. He issued it after what was called a levee at the White House. This was a party that the White House had on New Year's Day, tradition dated all the way back to George Washington's administration. And for this levee, they just threw open the doors of the White House. Everybody could come in. All the riffraff could come in off the street. It's a pre-presidential security era. And poor Lincoln, he was stuck for hours glad-handing and chatting with constituents and talking it up. And so I'm now going to read a very brief passage from my book that describes the actual signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. The White House levee ended around 3 p.m. An exhausted Lincoln repaired to his second-floor office where a finalized version of the Emancipation Proclamation awaited him. 5 pages carefully rendered by an official government calligrapher. The president was accompanied by Secretary of State Seward, Seward's son, and 2 other witnesses. On Lincoln's desk lay a steel-tipped pen. It had been promised to abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner as a memento of this historic occasion. The pen was rather worse for wear. Its wooden stem was covered with little pocks and indentations, the result of being gnawed on by Lincoln, a nervous habit. The president dipped the pen in an inkwell. He paused. During the levee, he must have shaken 1,000 hands. His arm felt stiff and numb. If his signature was shaky, he worried, it might appear that he had wavered, might seem as if he had, in quote, some compunctions. That's how he put it. This document would be closely scrutinized, of that he was certain. Lincoln, the instrument of Providence, had no compunctions. He had made up his mind. He put pen to paper. He signed his name to the proclamation, bold and true. Then he looked up at those gathered around his desk and smiled a weary smile. "That will do," said old Abe. And now I'll close by telling you just very briefly about this photograph. This is the last sitting portrait ever taken of President Lincoln. It was done by Alexander Gardner, the man who executed that landmark series of photographs at Antietam. And when he was developing the photograph, as often happens, this was the type of photograph used in those days. It had a glass plate negative, which was very delicate. And often during the production process, the negative would crack and even shatter. And typically what that meant was your image was just a dud. Hopefully you had a series of images, so there was another one you could draw upon, or maybe you just have to go back and get your subject to resit for another shooting. Well, while Gardner was developing this image, when it cracked, he recognized that nevertheless he had something extraordinary. First of all, this particular photograph is just unrivaled at capturing Lincoln's humanity. It's almost as if it sees into his soul. But also Gardner recognized that even the crack was kind of serendipitous. In a way, the crack, it's a unified image with 2 different pieces. And it struck Gardner that in a way that this mirrored what Lincoln had been doing during the years of the Civil War, struggling and fighting to hold together a fractured nation. So I want to close by saying that Lincoln's bold spirit, so evident during the Battle of Antietam, is still very much with us today. Thank you very much. Thank you. If there are any questions, I will direct you to the microphones on either side.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy hearing about Antietam. We've been to the battlefield many times. Your introduction goes on about political, diplomatic reasons for the South launching this invasion of Maryland. If that was true, who was in charge of making the decisions? Was Robert E. Lee considering diplomatic and political reasons when he deployed his troops and started battles, or was he taking orders directly from politicians? And if so, what sort of letters were exchanged to prove this one way or the other?
Sure, that's an excellent question. And Lee kind of freelanced a little bit the way I described that William French, the Union general, considered freelancing. He actually sent a letter kind of after the fact, and I'm going to be kind of paraphrasing here, I'll do my best, but he sent a letter after the fact to Jefferson Davis saying something like, I've headed towards the north, and I think he said something to the effect of, now is the most propitious, I'm not going to be able to say the right word, it's a nice $5 word, to invade Maryland since the outset of the war. And in a letter that he sent a couple days, and it kind of made it a fait accompli, he told Davis that he was already headed there and sort of made it clear. I mean, I guess Davis could have countermanded and said, pull back at once, but he didn't. He trusted Lee quite a bit. And in a letter a couple days later, he outlined that one of his reasons for launching this invasion at this time was, in quotes, the midterm elections that were coming up. So that consideration certainly came into play, the notion of disrupting the Union midterms. In fact, Lee was a very, very much a student of the Yankee press, and so he read newspapers that were Yankee newspapers, and so he was quite aware that there was kind of this waning commitment to the war effort in the North, and that maybe a victory might cause the Democrats to sweep in, replacing the Republicans in Congress, and all that might follow. So that's definitely well documented. As to the second piece of the question, inviting European interference, it was, the Union, rather the Confederacy was well aware, Davis and Lee, that was a possibility. It was something they'd sent diplomats to Europe, to England and France, hoping to achieve. I didn't encounter evidence specifically that at Antietam that Lee or Davis in exchange of letters said, I hope we can invite European interference. It was more part of the background, as it were. There was an awareness through repeated diplomatic efforts on the part of the Confederacy that the great powers of Europe were standing by, and it was something they hoped to invite. What they no doubt couldn't have possibly known was how close those powers actually were. They actually, on the day of, what was really interesting to me was on the day of the Battle of Antietam, so on September 17th of 1862, there was an exchange of letters between two high-level English and French diplomats saying, if there's one more loss, let's step in and negotiate a settlement on the terms of pulling these two parties apart. That letter was exchanged or sent on September 17th, and of course, because news took a week or two to travel between the continents, they could have no idea when they wrote that letter that the very battle that had it been a loss for the Union would have resulted in the interference was happening at the same time they're exchanging this diplomatic communique. Yes, sir.
Would you discuss the invasion of Kentucky, which took place at the same time as Maryland? I think it was known as the 1,000-mile offensive at the time. There was a relationship between the two. A lot of people don't realize the significance of Kentucky.
Well, you know what? That's a great question, and I apologize. I'm going to be out of my depth on that one, to tell you the truth. I know that the one thing that I comes to mind there is you're talking about also Union. You're talking about the Confederate.
Yes. They wanted to invade Ohio.
Yeah. The only detail that maybe useful or interesting detail I'll be able to add is that after the Battle of Antietam was over, George McClellan, the very hesitant general of the Union, he was, Lincoln wanted him to continue to pursue Lee into Virginia after the battle was over, and he was very anxious. McClellan was, because he thought Braxton Bragg might attack him. Braxton Bragg had been in Kentucky, many hundreds of miles away, but McClellan tended to be so hesitant and gingerly as a general that he had these anxieties that he better stay put in Maryland because Braxton Bragg could be coming for him. But sadly, that's about the only thing I'll be able to add. I don't know enough to give you a good answer about that invasion.
Well, there was a battle at a place called Perry Point, I think, in Kentucky. I don't know what it was in relation in time to Antietam, but it was also repulsed by the Union Army, and it prevented a successful invasion of Kentucky, which would have had great consequences.
Absolutely, no, and probably some of the self-same thinking going on. That Kentucky also a border state, and so two border state invasions at the same time could really, had they been successful, could really shake the Union's commitment. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry. Did you want to go? I have a quick question that everybody else may know. And that is why did the Emancipation Proclamation only apply to the rebel states?
That's a great question, and for a variety of reasons. One is the reason I gave, which is it would in effect, it was an assertion that the Confederacy was illegitimate. So that's one reason. Another reason is, interestingly enough, it didn't apply to those border states. Maryland was a slaveholding state. Kentucky was a slaveholding state, but it applied to those regions which stayed in rebellion. In fact, there were parts of Louisiana and parts of other Confederate states that had fallen under Union control where slavery didn't exist anymore, and those regions were not part of it. So it was, in a way, it was Lincoln was such a clever politician, so he recognized you want to push, besides losing the Battle of Antietam, pushing a state like Maryland to the Confederacy. Also he included those tenuous border states in the Emancipation Proclamation, demanded or asserted that the slaves were free in Maryland or Kentucky. That might have caused those uprisings in those states and caused them to tilt into the Confederacy. So it was aimed at, as it described, the areas still in rebellion. It's a very clever political calculation. It also had the hope that it would act as a beacon, luring slaves. It would act, one, as an assertion of Union primacy over the Confederacy. Two, act as a beacon, drawing Confederate slaves in the Confederacy northward. And three, as Union forces continued to move through the South, taking various pieces of territory, the Emancipation Proclamation would be the document that would allow them to declare the slaves free in those various regions. That was the calculation.
Political.
Political, yes.
As opposed to moral, in a way.
Yeah, well, there's a moral dimension, but yes, it was. Lincoln was very pragmatic, and he recognized, yes, it was very much a political calculation that he was weighing and making with thoughts about how the Union could best win the war.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
I know before, in the summer of 1862, Lincoln was determined to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and was talked out of it by Seward on the grounds that it had come in the wake of a number of battles that you referred to. But I've sometimes wondered, given Lincoln's determination to issue the proclamation, whether it might have been issued even if the Union had lost at Antietam. Has anyone considered that question?
That's a great question. In all my research, including reading many books about the Emancipation Proclamation specifically, as opposed to about Antietam, and many books on Antietam for that matter, people don't speculate on that, but it's a really great, what you're suggesting, conjecturing, is a good piece of conjecture, because one thing people forget is that after Antietam, but before the final proclamation, which was January 1st of 1863, you had the terrible Union loss at Fredericksburg. And that was in December of 1863. So when the Emancipation Proclamation was finally issued, the freshest thing for any person in the Union was a recent, very cataclysmic loss. And Lincoln still, issued the document. And so you're absolutely right. So Antietam, for those who don't know, Antietam, Lincoln, again, very clever, very expert politician. He issued what was called the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, which said that for those areas which remain in rebellion 100 days hence, which would be New Year's Day, 1863, he would issue a final proclamation. In that 100-day span, the Union succeeded in having a terrible, terrible loss at Fredericksburg, and he still went ahead with the proclamation. So yes, what you suggest, although, as I said, it wasn't something I came across in the books on the Emancipation Proclamation I read, it seems like a very valid piece of conjecture that perhaps Lincoln would have found a way to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, even if the Union hadn't conveniently given him a victory at some point to hang it on. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed this very much.